Thanks, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by congratulating Ed on the tremendous success that Heritage has had, and also to say that we believe that it's important for those of us that believe in free markets and free society to be working together, and I hope that will be the pattern going forward. My purpose today is to talk about my book, The Financial Crisis and Free Market Cure. I actually wrote the book before I even knew I was coming to Cato, so it's kind of an independent endeavor. People ask me why did I write the book, and the basic answer is I thought it might be interesting to have somebody that knew what he was talking about write a book about the financial crisis, because you listen to all these commentators and academics, they don't know what the world they're talking about, and that's kind of discouraging. In addition, I think it's very important to undo a myth. And the statists have been great at creating myths, and these myths become very destructive over the long term. And the myth that they've created in relation to the financial crisis is that it was caused by the deregulation of the banking industry and greed on Wall Street. Well, the simple fact is the banking industry was not deregulated under the Bush administration. We had a massive increase in regulation. We had the Patriot Act, we had the Privacy Act, and we had Sarbanes-Oxley. We were misregulated. We were not deregulated. And then secondly, while there's plenty of greed on Wall Street, I've been working with Wall Street for 40 years, there was not a sudden plague of greed. It's like some greed swept out of the north and Wall Street. No, that was nothing new, nothing different. That's not what caused the financial crisis. In my book, I talk about 6 themes. First, the primary cause of the financial crisis was government policy. We don't live in a free market in the United States. We live in a mixed economy. Mixture varies a lot by industry. The least regulated industry is technology, which, by the way, is done very well. The most regulated industry in the world is financial services. That's where we had our biggest problem. Not surprising, the most regulated industry is where we had our biggest problems. Secondly, government policy created a massive misinvestment, what's called a bubble, that got focused in the residential real estate market. That bubble burst, as all bubbles do, destroying trillions of dollars of wealth and millions of jobs. Thirdly, a number of large financial institutions, what's called Wall Street, made some very serious mistakes. If I had been in charge, I would have let those institutions fail. However, those mistakes were secondary, and they were in the context and incented by government policy. Fourthly, and maybe most unfortunately, almost everything we've done since the financial crisis started, man, this is a pretty long time period, even things that might be helping a little bit in the short term will radically reduce our standard of living in the long term. Fifth point, even though there's lots of economic causes of the financial crisis, the real cause and the real cure are philosophical, and I'm going to focus on that one in my presentation. And then finally, and most unfortunately, if we don't change direction economically, the United States faces some really serious long-term problems. We're doing some really bad things to our children and our grandchildren. What happened? We built too much residential real estate. We invested at least $3 trillion and maybe as much as $8 trillion in residential real estate. We built too many houses. We built too big of houses. We built houses in the wrong place. We should have been investing in technology, manufacturing capacity, education. We should have spent less and saved more. We should have borrowed a lot less from foreigners. Important thing that a lot of people don't get, housing is consumption. Because people individually think they invested in a house, they think it's an investment. It's not. We consume a house just like we consume an automobile. If you overinvest in housing, what you're really doing is over-consuming. So we had a massive overconsumption. It's analogous to eating your seed corn as an agricultural example. And in that process, we taught millions of people how to do the wrong thing. We taught them how to build houses, to be mortgage bankers, residential legal attorneys. Those millions of people are trying to learn how to do something new that's productive in a global economy, which is one reason it's been so difficult to deal with unemployment. In addition, construction wages are competitive with manufacturing wages. If you drive up construction wages, you drive up manufacturing wages, which we did with this artificial construction boom, and that drove millions of manufacturing jobs overseas to places like India and China. Now, initially, the people in India and China didn't know how to do that work very well. They've learned how to do it very well, and we're having a really difficult time getting those jobs back. How did we make a mistake of that kind of magnitude? That's a really big error. Interesting enough, markets are constantly making mistakes. They're constantly in correction processes, but they never make a mistake of that magnitude. It takes government policy to create that kind of mistake. In this case, the three big culprits are the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and government housing policy. In a fundamental context, the real cause of the financial crisis are errors made by the Federal Reserve. Something that many people know, but they don't really get what it means. In 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, the monetary system in the United States was nationalized. There is no private monetary system. The government owns the monetary system. If you're having problems in the monetary system, which is what this financial crisis is about, by definition, they're government policy problems. If interstate highway bridges were falling down, you'd say, well, the government owns the highways, the bridges are falling down, that's the government's problem. That's exactly true with monetary bridges falling down. The government owns the monetary system. That's what the Federal Reserve does. The Federal Reserve was created in theory to reduce volatility in the economy. In practice, what they do is reduce volatility in the short term and increase problems in the long term. In a free market, markets are constantly corrected. New businesses are being created. Old businesses are failing. The failing process is actually as important as the creation process, because until a business fails, its resources, its human capital, its physical capital can't be redirected to more productive uses. When you stop the downside correction process, all you do is create much bigger problems in the future. It'd be analogous to not disciplining a 13-year-old and then be surprised that they had bad behavior when they were 16. That's exactly what the Federal Reserve does. It keeps the corrections from happening. In addition, the only way the U.S. government can run its massive deficits is because of the Federal Reserve's ability to print money. Today, if the Federal Reserve couldn't print money, no telling what interest rates would be on U.S. debt. In fact, I don't think the U.S. could actually it would not be creditworthy if it couldn't print money. And that creates a huge temptation for politicians, right? Republicans and Democrats. I don't believe we'll ever discipline fiscal policy until we deal with monetary policy. Then we had some very specific errors by the Federal Reserve that led to the recent financial crisis. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, Alan Greenspan was head of the Federal Reserve. He'd been there a long time. He wanted to be a hero, the maestro. He was getting ready to retire, and we were having a minor correction in the early 2000s. So Greenspan wants to go out on a good note, so he starts lowering interest rates, which is the effect of printing money. And he creates negative real interest rates. So you could borrow at less than the inflation rate, and you could borrow at dramatically less than the appreciation rate on housing, which incented a huge investment in housing because you could borrow at such low interest rates. And then, right at the end of his term, Greenspan realizes he's screwed up, and he and his successor start raising interest rates very rapidly, and they create something called an inverted yield curve. Now, an inverted yield curve is an unnatural phenomenon. It never occurs in markets. Only the Fed can do it. What an inverted yield curve means that short-term rates are higher than long-term rates. Now, if you're going to make an investment, if you're going to invest for the long term, you're going to want a higher interest rate than the short term because it's riskier, it's less liquid. So markets never do that. Only the Federal Reserve can do that. Why that matters is banks make money by borrowing short and lending long. That's their whole business. And if you create inverted yield curves, banks have negative margins. They're buying watermelons for $10 and selling them for $8. Not a great business model, right? Now, the banking business is quirky in that you can get higher interest rates by taking more risk. So most of the bad loans it was a long-term trend, but they went exponential under this negative inverted interest rate, which was the longest in U.S. history. And one reason that happened, at the same time Bernanke had inverted interest rates, he was claiming, the Federal Reserve was claiming there was not going to be a recession, that good times were going to go on forever. So he created a huge incentive for banks to take inordinate risk and claim that good times would go on forever. In a certain fundamental sense, we couldn't have mathematically had a bubble without the Fed printing the money. This is one question that the statists never answer. Where did the money come from if the Federal Reserve didn't provide it? Simple question. Second factor was FDIC. FDIC insures bank deposits. It sounds like a good thing. Your bank deposits are insured. It destroys market discipline. I'll give you a simple example. BB&T operated in Atlanta. We competed with a number of community banks. We took over one of those community banks after it failed, and it looked like a lot of community banks had failed. It was 10 guys, 12 guys that had been in the hotel business, motel business, got together, they started a bank, they put in a little bit of capital, and then they leveraged it radically by buying certificates of deposit from average consumers at very high interest